Yes, so I will be introducing our next speaker, Darius MacKay. Darius is speaking on the dichotomy between night and day in early modern Europe. He is a fourth-year history major, and he hopes to pursue an education degree and continue his passion for teaching. In his presentation, Darius will draw on the moralization of night and day, originating in the Christian canon, to examine how this symbolism was weaponized by authorities against marginalized groups, namely women in the lower classes. So Darius, the stage is yours.
All right, awesome. Thank you. Share screen. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Shoot, sorry, I'm just running into some technical difficulties. Oops. Perfect. Okay. So like Kaylee just said, I'm discussing dichotomies of nighttime in early modern Europe specifically. I just want to preface this by saying the early modern period in Europe it's a loose definition, to put it simply. It usually ranges from about the 13th, 14th century to the 18th, 19th century, but that definition changes upon who you ask. So that's just a general area. So it's like late Middle Ages, Renaissance to the Enlightenment. And in short, my topic tackles dichotomies of nighttime and how authoritative figures use contemporary understandings of the night to ostracize certain groups of people. And more often than not, it happened to fall into the lower classes and specifically women. Now, to understand what nighttime was to early modern Europeans, you have to understand the religious metaphor in Christianity for light and darkness. It falls into pretty much light being metaphorical for, piety, goodness, God, and darkness being a metaphor for sin, temptation, evil, and the devil / Satan. Take up with that. Sorry, I'm just looking at some notes just to make sure I cover everything, because this section is pretty dense. So the sun marked the end of the civilized, orderly day of life. The night was incredibly dark in most cities, especially in the Middle Ages, because there was no street lighting. Because of the religious belief that darkness held, these temptations were more powerful at night because there was no lights, no goodness, no piety. And what's really interesting is you could see how this religious metaphor, religious understanding of darkness and light was applied to like literature. I know Macbeth, like there's a lot of Shakespearean works, specifically Macbeth, that show that things that happen at night tend to lean towards indulgence or full-on falling into sinful activities. Macbeth, Richard III, and countless fairy tales from the time. It was a little bit before the Brothers Grimm, but if you trace the origin of those fairy tales, darkness is a metaphor for evil, for bad, etc. All right, so with all that religious explanations and definitions out of the way, night before the 16th century, because the night was thought to be dangerous, a dangerous, moral, corrupting time of day, authoritative figures like local princes and lords began constructing the other in the night. And we see this with two primary examples. I just used the 16th century because that was the Protestant Reformation. We see two primary examples of this with Nightwalkers in early modern England specifically, and witches all over Europe. And this cycle of deterioration is something I will talk about a little bit later once I get through the examples of night walking and witches. So night walking in early modern England, it's going to sound a little bit picky, but there was a difference between walking at night and night walking. Because of the hegemony of the night, like I mentioned earlier, sinful temptations were heightened in the darkness. And people traverse the night semi-regularly. I mean, it was half the day. So a lot of times, especially the lower classes, they could only move around during the night. But it was still mandated in a lot of villages, and specifically like larger cities like London, that people who were out in nighttime carry some form of illumination on them, whether that was like a little candle or like a lantern a little bit later in the period. But because of, understandings of nighttime, it was still a suspicious activity. And watchmen usually stopped anyone they saw at night, lantern or not. Now, night walking, I know it sounds like I'm being very picky, but it was a huge issue with night walking, especially at this time. Night walking was only a crime if one's traversal of the night was directly connected to a more serious crime, whether that was robbery, assault, murder, etc. So it was really hard to prove that you were night walking, not walking at night, but that didn't stop watchmen from stopping, the poor vagrants like you see in this picture and arresting them for it anyway. And according to my readings, this quote about the stereotypical nightwalker in 14th century England, quote, "A man who sleeps by day and wanders about at night, participating in questionable nocturnal activities." And the reason they were able to come up with this definition was because of what people thought about darkness and night. Just the quote above it, "No one would venture out at night unless they had criminal intent or sought to gratify the selfish and sinful pleasures of greed and lust." So that's how they were able to justify it. Now, male prostitution may have fallen under this umbrella of questionable nocturnal activities, but the term didn't come inherently sexualized until later centuries, which we'll get into a little bit later. And now witches. I know this is like when you tell people that you study European history, they'll probably find a way to bring up witches. It's important to define what witches and the like actually meant to early modern Europeans, because some things might get screwed in like with stereotypes and everything. So the definition of witches and the actual crime of witchcraft was service to the Prince of Darkness, like the quote says, or the devil. Magic discussions of magic usually fell under it, but it wasn't magic specifically. The crime was the service to the devil, and they were able to prove this with contemporary demonology to the time. So another important quote from my reading is, "The questions posed to the accused witch and the confessions elicited focused on two typically nocturnal activities: the initial agreement with the devil and the witch's Sabbath," which is pictured on the slide. The initial agreement with the devil usually was the question of whether or not the accused was seduced by the devil into some form of sexual intercourse, and they were able to prove this by a witch's mark or a devil's mark that was left somewhere on the body, typically hidden by regular clothing. And the reason that specifically this targeted women was because of demonology. At the time, it stated the devil could tempt men and women during the day. It doesn't really matter, he could tempt either sex. But the devil most succeeded with seducing women during the night, because I feel like I've said this a million times by now, temptations and the devil were more powerful at night, at least in their understanding of darkness. It just made sense because there was no light, there was no piety at this time. And like I said, the picture here shows the witch's Sabbath. In the book that I read that, heavily influenced my research, the author, Craig Kosolowski, he just mentioned an anecdote that if you saw a group of women dancing in a field during the day, you'd think like, okay, it's kind of weird, but whatever. But if you saw it at night, your mind immediately leapt to witchcraft because of everything I've just talked about. The cycle of deterioration that I mentioned earlier emerged as a result of these understandings of nighttime and the act of, local authoritative figures pushing basically everyone on the outskirts of society into the nights. So nightwalkers, witches, and general criminals, I'm assuming, were consistently expelled into the night because they had fallen into its simple temptations. But because there were more of them existing in the night as a result of these expulsions, nighttime became increasingly more dangerous. It's a constant cycle that keeps deteriorating. So I hope that makes sense. All right, nocturnal youth culture. So this is what drew me into the subject initially. It existed throughout the Middle Ages and the early modern period, and something that that hasn't been really represented in any of my research that I found is how like vital it was to early modern life. Just at this time, there was a huge belief in the early modern period that the family was the social dynamic, that was the unit. And if you didn't have this youth culture, that the family, like, you know, you can have courtship or dating, you can have marriage, or you'd have them in such a way that they would exist in a completely different way than we understand. That's just something that scholarship hasn't really spoken to. I found a couple of things, but they were really hard to find. And an aspect inherent to this culture is a desire to escape from authority, whether it be, you know, the parents or even like local authoritative figures like lords. And they use the night as their refuge. And something that I've found, there's this distinction between upper class youth culture at nights, or nocturnal youth culture, and lower class nocturnal youth culture, because one occurred inside and one occurred outside. Nocturnal youth culture by candlelight, which happened in the upper classes, it typically happened in like large estates. Obviously, like you have lords and ladies, and their children. They would have a secluded part of the home they could go to when, you know, paternal authority, like their parents were asleep, and they were able to unwind, relax, talk, even in some cases, which is vital to this courtship culture. They'd invite, you know, a suitor over, and they'd be able to spend time together without that watchful eye of, you know, a mom or a dad or a grandma, aunt, like watching their every move to make sure they're not being sinful. It wasn't really looked down on. It was kind of considered a necessity of life for the upper classes, but it flips when you go down to the lower class. Yeah. So there was this difference because the lower classes youth culture, they didn't have big estates to go to a secluded room. It was, a lot of them either lived in like a 2-room apartment or they lived on the street. So one existed actually outside in the night, and that was thought to be incredibly immoral. There was a case in early modern Holland, specifically Amsterdam. There was this court practice where, you know, 2 people would sneak out and they'd have essentially a picnic in the middle of the night, and that caused a moral panic in early modern Holland because they were scared of youth sexual degradation, because they were outside alone at night, actually inside the night. All right, new interpretations of darkness. It's a little bingo card for anybody who studies European history at all. The Reformation changed pretty much everything. Protestant churches, because of persecutions in certain countries, they were forced into the night pretty much. If they were caught worshiping during the day, they were persecuted. So they had to shift their worshiping into night, and the Anabaptists are famous for doing this. I'll make this part pretty quick. The most important part of the Reformation is a new thought about nighttime. Instead of nighttime being the ultimate like evil part of the day, it was thought of, there was more of a balance. Without the darkness, I don't mean to sound like Batman. Without dark, you can't have light. Without sin, you can't have piety. Without good, you can't have evil, pretty much. And there's this dichotomous definition that the Anabaptists developed. If you were able to resist the temptations, resist the sin at night, and you were able to push past that, I'm just going to quote someone here. One one could contemplate and worship God in a manner unseen before. Beyond the sin and evil inside the darkness, profound reflection awaited, which is a completely different thought than night bad, pretty much. So moving on to the next one, it's court culture, court spectacles, and street lighting. The Baroque period, I learned this the other day, is around the 17th century. It's just called that because of Baroque style art during the period, and it was easier to categorize this little century in the early modern period by calling it the Baroque period. The Baroque princes and nocturnalization. So because of this new idea of the night, princes began taking steps of nocturnalization, which simply put, it was the process of making the night more accessible, which itself was a showcase of political power, or it could potentially be a grand showcase of political power for them. At this period, we started seeing court spectacles like carnivals, masquerades, festivals, ballets, operas, etc. And there was this idea that if you introduce light into night, if you illuminate the night, you're eradicating sin and temptation with righteousness and piety. And the more excessive these shows of light were, the more pious they were, and therefore the more politically powerful they were, to show people that how powerful you were over the night, over sin, etc. The most famous, the most well-known one of these princes, I'm just going to throw it out there, was Louis XIV. He called himself the Sun King. He actually introduced street lighting into France, which itself, it made the night more accessible, and it introduced the idea of a public sphere for the city. And the quote down there, it just shows you how Louis XIV saw this new idea of nighttime. He saw it as, like, with court culture especially, it was a much more effective way to govern and to pacify people than going to wars and making grand showcases of, territorial victories. More so, like, focus on giving the people like a little indulgence every once in a while to keep them at bay. And feminizing nocturnal youth culture. So this took place during like the 17th century. So don't get me wrong, darkness and the night still had a negative reputation. It was just a bit more of a nuanced negative reputation. And youth culture it exploded with the advent of especially street lighting. Places like coffee houses, pubs, public spaces like that, they could stay open later into the day, which gave access to, lower class people having a place to go, having a place to escape, especially for like courtship. One second. Pleasures of the night. So pleasures of the night is just kind of a blanket term for court culture, like carnivals, masquerades, operas, etc. These were seen to be, they were seen to be feminine because of the way they indulged sin. This quote from Kozlowski right here: the entertainment of the daylight hours, such as tourneys, the hunt, horse racing, and the like, contrast with pleasures of the night, such as theater, cards, and conversation. Those were seen to be more indulgent and transgressive activities, mainly because women could participate in them. That was why they were seen to be more transgressive. And then we have a quote down here from, I had never heard about this guy until I read Kozlowski's book. In the past, when most nations of Europe were somewhat rawer, but also stronger and more manly, they more loved strenuous bodily exercises. Now, as they become more polite and refined, the calmer and more thoughtful pastimes replace the physical ones. Basically, his way of saying, we used to be much more manly when we didn't indulge into the night. And in the early modern period, especially in medieval, but more so in the early modern period, there's this idea that falling into temptation or being seduced into temptation was inherently feminine because, to go back to Christianity, to original sin. Eve was the one that the devil successfully tempted, not Adam. And if you study the early modern period thoroughly, you're going to see this motif when people gender activities like the night, like, you know, ballet, like carnivals, festivals. Indulgence equals feminine. All right, last slide here is the new Nightwalker. Speaking of, you know, femininity, I guess, in this period. From the 16th, 17th century, an increasing number of cases of feminine Nightwalkers was brought to court. And have another quote here from one of my other readings. A bureaucratic bust during the 1640s, followed by a peak of cases in which Nightwalker was for the first time identified as an enticer of men by London principal magistrates. This title was near to becoming an exclusive badge of disordered femininity in the 17th century London. So that's a total flip from what it was 300 years prior. 300 years prior was the vagrant male criminal looking to cause trouble in the night. Prostitution may have fallen under that umbrella, but now it's completely, this term has become completely feminine and completely sexual. And this happened for a variety of reasons, mainly so because you had poor women were outside, especially with, you know, introduction of street lighting. Public spaces were open later. They were out later into the night. Nocturnal youth culture is still going on, and because of the advent of public spaces like coffee houses and pubs and even parks, people are out later and they're spending time with each other later. And like, that's not to say that upper class women weren't out in the night as well, but lower class women were more suspicious because they were unattached. Like, upper class women were usually accompanied by either their father, their brother, or an uncle, or their boyfriend / husband. Lower class women were not, so they were profiled because of it. It should be noted that a heightened number of female Nightwalker cases was a result of also political crackdowns on youth culture. In these coffee houses, I haven't really touched on it. It's not entirely relevant to this presentation, but there was a dissenting political discourse occurring in these coffee houses. And because of that discourse, political authorities sought to keep the process of nocturnalization as an upper class luxury. And they set like restrictions on these coffee houses, like they had to close by, I don't know, like 9 o'clock. And they used this unruly discourse as an excuse. They used unruly nature and stereotypes of lower class people, especially women out at night, as an excuse to keep nocturnalization as strictly an upper class luxury. And I just have one final quote, kind of everything I just said. Due to increasing street lighting and public spaces, there were more people, especially young women, out during the night. By merely existing on a dark or lantern-lit street, young women fit the description of the spiritual dangers of nocturnal activities and were profiled because of it. And yeah, sorry if I went over time, but it's a big subject.